Again, the adventure of the solitary cyclist. From the years of 1894 to 1901, inclusive, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was a very busy man. It is safe to say that there was no public case of any difficulty in which he was not consulted during those 8 years, and there were hundreds of private cases, some of them of the most intricate and extraordinary character, in which he played a prominent part. Many startling successes and a few unavoidable failures were the outcome of this long period of continuous work. As I have preserved very full notes of all these cases, and was myself personally engaged in many of them, it may be imagined that it is no easy task to know which I should select to lay before the public. I shall, however, persevere my former rule, and give the preference to those cases which derive their interest not so much from the brutality of the crime as from the ingenuity and dramatic quality of the solution. For this reason, I will now lay before the reader the facts connected with Miss Violet Smith, the solitary cyclist of Charlington, and the curious sequel of our investigation which culminated in unexpected tragedy. It is true that the circumstances did not admit any striking illustration of those powers for my friend is famous, but there were some points about the case which made it stand out in those long records of crime from which I gather my material for these little narratives. On referring to my notebook for the year 1895, I find that it was upon Saturday, the 23rd of April, when we first heard of Miss Violet Smith. Her visit was, I remember, extremely unwelcome to Holmes, for he was immersed at the moment in a very abstruse and complicated problem concerning the particular persecution to which John Vincent Harden, a well-known tobacco millionaire, had been subjected. My friend, who loved above all things the precision and concentration of thought, resented anything which distracted his attention from the matter in hand, and yet without a harshness which he was foreign to his nature. It was impossible to refuse to listen to the story of the young and beautiful woman, tall, graceful, and queenly, who presented herself at Baker Street late in the evening and implored his assistance and advice. It was vain to urge that his time was already fully occupied, for the young lady had come with a determination to tell her story, and it was evident that nothing short of force could get her out of the room until she had done so. With a resigned air and a somewhat weary smile, Holmes begged the beautiful intruder to take a seat and inform us what it was that was troubling her.
At least it cannot be your health.
Oh, at least it cannot be your health, said he, as his keen eyes darted over her. So ardent a cyclist must be full of energy. She glanced down in surprise at her own feet, and I observed the slight roughening in the side of the sole caused by the friction of the edge of the pedal.
Yes, I bicycle a good deal, Mr. Holmes, and that has something to do with my visit to you today.
My friend took the lady's ungloved hand and examined it as close with attention and as little sentiment as a scientist would show to a specimen. You'll excuse me, I'm sure. It was my business. As he said as he dropped it, I nearly fell into an error of supposing that you were typewriting. Of course, it is obvious that it is music. You observe the spatulate's finger end, Watson, which is common to both professions. There is a spirituality about the face, however. He gently turned towards the light, which the typewriter does not generate. This lady is a musician.
Yes, Mr. Holmes, I teach music.
In the country, I presume, from your complexion.
Yes, sir, near Farnham, on the borders of Surrey.
A beautiful neighbourhood, and full of the most interesting associations. You remember, Watson, that it was near there that we took Archie Stamford, the forger. Now, Miss Violet, what has happened to you near Farnham, on the borders of Surrey? The young lady, with great clearness and composure, made the following curious statement.
My father is dead, Mr. Holmes. He was James Smith, who conducted the orchestra of the Old Imperial Theatre. My mother and I were left without a relation in the world except for one uncle, Ralph Smith, who went to Africa 25 years ago, and we never heard a word from him since. When father died, we were left very poor, but one day we were told that there was an advertisement in the Times inquiring for our whereabouts. You can imagine how excited we were, for we thought that someone had left us our fortune. We went at once to the lawyer whose name was given in the paper. There we met two gentlemen, Mr. Carruthers and Mr. Woodley, who were home on a visit from South Africa. They said that my uncle was a friend of theirs and had died some months before the great poverty in Johannesburg, and that he had asked them both with his last breath to hunt up his relations and see that they were in no want. It seems strange to us that Uncle Ralph, who took no notice of us when he was alive, should be so careful to look after us when he was dead. But Mr. Carruthers explained that the reason was that my uncle had just heard of the death and of his brother and felt so responsible for our fate.
Excuse me, said Holmes. When was this interview?
Last December, 4 months ago.
Proceed.
Mr. Woodley seemed to me the most odious person, for he was ever making eyes at me, the coarse, puffy-faced, red-moustached young man, and his hair plastered down on each side of his forehead. I thought that he was perfectly hateful, and that I was sure that Cyril would not wish me to know such a person.
Oh, Cyril was his name, said Holmes, smiling. The young lady blushed and laughed.
Yes, Mr. Holmes, Cyril Morton, an electrical engineer, and we hope to be married at the end of the summer. Dear me, how did I get talking about him? What I wished to say was that Mr. Woodley was perfectly odious, and that Mr. Carruthers, who was a much older man, was mere agreeable. He was a dark, sallow, clean-shaven, silent person, but he had polite manners and a pleasant smile. He inquired how we were left, and on finding that we were very poor, he suggested that I should come and teach music to his only daughter, aged 10. I said that I did not like to leave my mother, on which he suggested that I should go home to her every weekend, and he offered me 100 a year, which was certainly splendid pay. So it ended by my accepting, and I went down to Chiltern Grange, about 6 miles from Farnham. Mr. Carruthers was a widower, but he engaged a lady housekeeper, a very respectable elderly person, named Mrs. Dixon, who took after his establishment. The child was a dear, and everything promised well. Mr. Carruthers was very kind and very musical, and we had most pleasant evenings together. Every weekend I went home to my mother in town. The first flaw in my happiness was at the arrival of the red-moustached Mr. Woodley. He came for a visit of a week, and, it seemed like 3 months to me. He was a dreadful person, a bully to everyone else, but he had something fiercely worse. He made odious love to me, boasted of his wealth, and that if I married him I would have the finest diamonds in London, and finally, when I should have nothing to do with him, he seized me by the arms one day, and after dinner he was hideously strong, and he swore that he would not let me go until I'd kissed him. Mr. Carruthers came in and tore him off of me, on which he turned upon his own host, knocking him down and cutting on his face. That was the end of his visit, as you can imagine. Mr. Carruthers apologized to me the next day, and assured me that I should never be exposed to such an insult again. I have not seen Mr. Woodley since. And now, Mr. Holmes, I come at last to the special thing which has caused me to ask for your advice today. You must know that every Saturday afternoon I ride on my bicycle to Farningham Station in order to get there by the 12:21 or 12:22 to town. The road from Chilton Grange is a lonely one, and at a spot it is particularly so, for it lies over a mile between Charlingham Heath upon one side and the woods which lie around Charlington Hall upon the other. You could not find a more lonely tract of road anywhere, and it was quite rare to meet so much as a cart, a peasant, or until you reached the high road of Crockberry Hill. 2 weeks ago, as I was passing this place, I chanced to look back over my shoulder, and about 200 yards behind me, I saw a man who was also on a bicycle. He seemed to be a middle-aged man with a short, dark beard. I looked back before I reached Farnham, but the man was gone, so I thought no more about it. But you can imagine how surprised I was, Mr. Holmes, when on my return on Monday I saw the same man on the road, on the same stretch. My astonishment was increased when the incident occurred again, exactly as before on the following Saturday and Monday. He always kept his distance, but did not molest me in any way, but still, it was certainly very odd. I mentioned it to Mr. Carruthers, who seemed interested in what I had to say, and told me that he had ordered a horse and a trap, so that in the future I should not have to pass over these lonely roads without some companion. The horse and trap were to come this week, but for some reason they were not delivered, and again I had to cycle to the station. That was this morning. You can think that I looked out when I came to Charlington Heath, and there, sure enough, was the man, exactly as been the 2 weeks before. He always kept so far from me that I could not clearly see his face, but I know it certainly was someone whom I did not know. He was dressed in a dark suit with a cloth cap. The only thing about his face I could clearly see was his dark beard. Today I was not alarmed, but I was filled with curiosity, and I determined to find out who he was and what he wanted. I slowed down my machine, but he slowed down his. Then I stopped altogether, but he stopped also. Then I laid a trap for him. With a sharp turning in the road that I pedaled very quickly around this, then I stopped and waited. I expected him to shoot around and pass me before he could stop, but he never appeared. Then I went back to look around the corner. I could see a mile of road, but he was not on it. To make it more extraordinary, there was no side road at this point down which he could have gone.
Holmes chuckled and rubbed his hands. "This case certainly presents some features of its own," said he. "How much time elapsed between your turning the corner and your discovery that the road was clear?"
2 or 3 minutes.
Then he could not have retreated down the road, and you say that there are no side roads.
None.
Then he certainly took a footpath on one side or the other.
It could have not been on either side of the heath, or I should have seen him.
So by the process of exclusion, we arrived to the fact that he made his way towards Charlton Hall, which, as I understand, is situated on its own grounds on one side of the road. Anything else?
Nothing, Mr. Holmes, save that I was perplexed that I felt I should not be happy until I had seen you and had your advice.
Holmes sat in silence for a little time. "Where is the gentleman to whom you are engaged?" he asked at last.
He is in Midland Electrical Company, at Coventry.
He would not pay you a surprise visit.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, as if I should not have known him.
Have you any other admirers?
Several, before I knew Cyril.
And since?
There was only this dreadful man Woodley, if you can call him an admirer.
No one else? Our fair client seemed a little confused. Who was he? Asked Holmes.
Oh, it may be a mere fancy of mine, but it has seemed to me that my employer, Mr. Carruthers, takes a great deal of interest in me. We're thrown rather together. I play his accompaniment in the evening. He has never said anything, and he is a perfect gentleman, but a girl always knows.
Ha! Holmes looked grave. What does he do for a living?
He is a rich man.
No carriages or horses?
Well, at least he is fairly well-to-do, but he goes into the city 2 or 3 times a week. He is deeply interested in the South African gold shares.
You will let me know of any fresh developments, Mrs. Smith, or Miss Smith. I'm very busy just now, and I will find some time to make some inquiries into your case. In the meantime, take no step without letting me know. Goodbye, and I trust that we shall have nothing but good news from you. Is it part of the settled order of nature that such a girl should have followers? Said Holmes as he pulled the meditative pipe. But for choice not on bicycles and lonely country roads. Some secretive lover, beyond all doubt. But there are curious and suggestive details about the case, Watson. That he should appear only at that point. Exactly. The first effort must be made to find out who the tenants of Charlington are. And then again, how about the connection between Carruthers and Woodley, since they appear to be men of such a different type? How they came both to be looked upon in Ralph Smith's relations. One more point. What sort of menagerie is it that pays double the market price for a governess, but does not keep a horse, although 6 miles from the station? Odd, Watson. Very odd. You will go down, then? Now, my fellow, you will go down. This may be some trifling intrigue, and I cannot break from my other important research for the sake of it. On Monday you will arrive early at Farnham. You will conceal yourself at Charlington Heath, and you will observe these facts for yourself, and act as your own judgment advises. Then, having inquired as to the occupants of the hall, you will come back to me and report. And now, Watson, not another word of the matter until we have both solid stepping stones on which we may hope to get across to our solution. We had ascertained from the lady that she went down on the Monday by the train which leaves Waterloo at 9:50, so I started early and caught the 9:13. At Farnham Station I had no difficulty in being directed to Charlington Heath. It was impossible to mistake the scene of the young lady's adventure, for the road runs between the open heath on one side and an old yew hedge upon the other, surrounding a park which is studded with magnificent trees. There was a main gateway of lichen-studded stone, each side of a pillar surmounted a moulding of Herrick's emblems. But besides this central carriage drive, I observed several points where there were gaps in the hedge, and paths leading through them. The house was invisible from the road, and the surroundings all spoke of gloom and decay. The heath was covered in golden patches of flowering gorse, gleaming magnificently in the light of the bright spring sunshine. Behind one of these clumps I took my position, so as to command both the gateway of the hall and the long stretch of road upon either side. It had been deserted when I left it, but now I saw a cyclist riding down the opposite direction in that which I had come. He was clad in a dark suit, and I saw that he had a black beard. On reaching the end of the Charlington grounds, he sprang up from his machine and led it through a gap in the hedge, disappearing from my view. A quarter of an hour passed, and then a second cyclist appeared. This time it was a young lady coming from the station. I saw her look about her as she came to Charlington Hedge. An instant later, the man emerged from the hiding place and sprang upon his cycle and followed her. On all the broad landscape there were only these 2 moving figures, the graceful girl sitting very straight upon a machine, and the man behind her bending low over his handlebars, with a curiously furtive suggestion in every movement. She looked back at him and slowed her pace. He slowed also. She stopped, and he stopped at once too, keeping 200 yards between them. Her next movement was unexpected as she sprinted. She suddenly whisked her wheels around and dashed straight at him. He was as quick as she, however, and darted out in a desperate flight. Presently she came back up the road again, her head haughtily in the air, not deigning to take further notice of her silent attendant. He had turned also, and still kept his distance until the curve of the road had hid them from my sight. I remained in my hiding place, and it was well that I did so, for presently the man repaired his cycling slowly back. He turned in at the hall gates and dismounted from his machine. For few minutes I could see him standing among the trees. His hands were raised, and he seemed to be settling his necktie. Then he mounted a cycle and rode away from me down the drive towards the hall. I ran across the heath and peered through the trees. Far away I could catch glimpses of the old grey building with its bristling Tudor chimneys, but the drive ran through a dense shrubbery, and I saw no more of my man. However, it seemed to me that I had done a fairly good morning's work, and I walked back in high spirits to Farnham. The local house agent could tell me nothing of Charlington Hall, and referred me to a well-known firm of Pall Mall. There I halted on my way home, and met with the courtesy of my representative. No, I could not have Charlington Hall for the summer. I was just too late. It had been let out a month ago. Mr. Williamson was the name of the tenant. He was a respectable elderly gentleman. The polite agent was afraid he could say no more, as the affairs of his client were not matters that he could openly discuss. Mr. Sherlock Holmes listened with attention to my long report, which I was able to present him that evening, but it did not elicit that word of curt praise which I had hoped for, and should have valued. On the contrary, his austere face was even more severe than usual as he commented upon his things that I had done and the things I had not. Your hiding place, my dear Watson, was very faulty. You should have been behind the hedge. Then you would have had a close view of the interesting person. As it is, you were some 100 yards away, and thinks she does not know the man. I am convinced she does. Why otherwise should he be so desperately anxious that she should not get so near him as to see his features? You describe him as bending over the handlebar. Concealment again, you see. You really have done remarkably badly. He returns to the house, and you want to find out who he is. You come to a London house agent. What should I have done, then? I cried with some heat. Gone to the nearest public house. That is the centre of country gossip. They would have told you every name, from the master to the scullery maid. Williamson. It conveys nothing to my mind. If he is an elderly man, he is not an active cyclist who spirits away from an athletic young lady's pursuit. What have we gained from your expedition? The knowledge that the girl's story is true, I never doubted. That there is a connection between the cyclist and the Hall, I never doubted that either. That the Hall is tenanted by Williamson, who's the better for that? Well, well, my dear sir, don't look so depressed. We can do a little more until Saturday evening. And in the meantime, I may make one or two inquiries myself. Next morning we had a note from Miss Smith, recounting shortly and accurately the very incidents which I had seen, but the path of the letter lay in the postscript.
I am sure that you will respect my confidence, Mr. Holmes, when I tell you that my place here has nothing difficult owing to the fact that my employer has proposed marriage to me. I am convinced that his feelings are most deep and most honorable. At the same time, my promise is, of course, given. He took my refusal very seriously, but also very gently. You can understand, however, that the situation is a little strained.
Our young friend seems to be getting into deep waters, said Holmes thoughtfully as he finished the letter. This case certainly presents more features of interest and more possibility of development than I had originally thought. I should be none the worse for a quiet, peaceful day in the country, and I am inclined to run down this afternoon and test one or two theories which I have formed. Holmes's quiet day in the country had a singular termination, for he arrived at Baker Street late in the evening with a cut lip and a discolored lump upon his forehead, besides a general air of dissipation which would have made his own person the fitting object of Scotland Yard investigation. He was immensely tickled by his own adventures, and laughed heartily as he recounted them. I get so little active exercise that it is always a treat, said he. You are aware that I have some proficiency in the good old British sport of boxing. Occasionally it is of service. Today, for example, I should have come out very ignominiously grief without it. I begged him to tell me what had happened. I found that country pub which I had already recommended to your notice, and there I made my discreet inquiries. I was in the bar and had a gregarious landlord and was giving me all that I wanted. Williamson is a white-bearded man, and he lives alone with a small staff of servants at the Hall. There is a rumor that he is or has been a clergyman, but one or two incidents of his short residence at the Hall struck me as particularly an ecclesiastical. I have already made some inquiries as a clerical agency, and they tell me that there was a man of that name in orders whose career had been a singularly dark one. The landlord further informed me that there are usually week-end visitors. A warm lot, sir, at the Hall, and especially one gentleman with a red mustache, Mr. Woodley by name, who was always there. We got as far as this man when whom should walk in but the gentleman himself, who had been drinking his beer in a tap-room, and we heard the whole conversation. Who was I? What did I want? What did I mean by asking questions? He had a fine flow of language, and his adjectives were very vigorous. He ended his string of abuse with a vicious backhander, which I failed to extremely avoid. The next few minutes were delicious. It was a straight left against a ruffian slogging. I emerged as you see me. Mr. Woodley went home in a cart. So ended my country trip, and it must be confessed that, however enjoyable, my day on the Surrey border has not been much more profitable than your own. Thursday brought another letter from our client.
You will not be surprised, Mr. Holmes,
said she,
that I hear I am leaving Mr. Carruthers' employment. Even the high pay cannot reconcile me to the discomfort of my situation. On Saturday I come up to town, and I do not intend to return. Mr. Carruthers has got the trap, and so the dangers of my lonely road, if there ever were any dangers, are now over. As to the special cause of my leaving, it is not merely the strange situation with Mr. Carruthers, but it is the appearance of that odious man, Mr. Woodley. He was always hideous, but he looks more awful than ever now, for he appears to have had an accident and is much disfigured. I saw him out the window, but I am glad to say that I did not meet him. He had a long talk with Mr. Carruthers, who seemed much excited afterwards. Woodley must be staying in the neighborhood, for he did not sleep here, and yet I caught a glimpse of him again this morning slinking about in the shrubbery. I would sooner have a savage wild animal loose than in that place. I loathe and fear him more than I say. How can Mr. Carruthers endure such a creature for a moment? However, all my troubles will be over on Saturday.
So I trust, Watson, so I trust, said Holmes, gravely. There is some deep intrigue going on around that little woman, and it is our duty to see that no one molests her on her last journey. I think, Watson, that we must spare some time to run down together on Saturday morning, and make sure that this curious, inconclusive investigation has no untoward ending. I confess that I was not up to now taking a very serious view of this case, which had seemed to me rather grotesque and bizarre rather than dangerous. That a man should lie in wait and to follow a very handsome woman is no unheard of thing, and if he had so little audacity that he not only dared to address her, but even fled from her approach, he was not a very formidable assailant. The ruffian Woodley was a different person, but except on one occasion he had not molested our client. Now he visited the house of Crothers without intruding upon her presence. The man of the bicycle was dubiously a member of those weekend parties of the guests with which the publican had spoken. But who was he, and what he wanted was obscure as ever. It was the severity of Holmes's manner, and the fact that he slipped a revolver into his pocket before leaving our rooms, which impressed me with a feeling that tragedy again might prove to lurk behind this curious train of events. A rainy night had been followed by the glorious morning, and the heath-covered countryside, with glowing clumps of flowering gorse, seemed all the more beautiful to the eyes of the many of the duns and drabs of the grey slates of London. Holmes and I walked along the broad, sandy road, hailing the fresh morning air and rejoicing in the music of the birds and the fresh breath of the spring. From a rise in the road on the shoulder of the Crooksbury Hill, we could see the grim hall bristling out from amidst the ancient oaks, which, as old as they were still younger than the building which they surrounded. Holmes pointed out the long tract of road which wound a reddish-yellow band between the brown of the heath and the budding green of the woods. Far away, a black dot could be seen, a vehicle moving in our direction. Holmes gave an exclamation of impatience. "I give it a margin of half an hour," said he. "If that is her trap, she must be making for an earlier train. I fear, Watson, that she will pass the Charlington before we have a possibility to meet her." From the instant that we passed the rise, we could no longer see the vehicle, but we hastened onwards at such a pace that my sedentary life began to tell upon me, and I was compelled to fall behind. Holmes, however, was always in training, for he had inexhaustible stores of nervous energy upon which to draw. His springy step never slowed until suddenly, when he was halted 100 yards in front of me, and I saw him throw up his hand in a gesture of grief and despair. At the same instant, an empty dog-cart and horse cantering, the reins trailing, appeared around the curve of the road and rattling swiftly towards us. "Too late, Watson, too late!" cried Holmes as I ran panting to his side. "Fool that I was to not allow for that earlier train. The abduction, Watson, abduction, murder, heaven knows what. Block the road, stop the horse, that's right. Now jump in and let us see if we can repair the consequences of our own blunder." We had sprung inside the dog-cart, and Holmes, after turning the horse, gave it a sharp cut of the whip, and we flew back along the road. As we turned the curve, the whole stretch of road between the hall and the heath was opened up. Holmes gasped. I grasped Holmes' arm. "That's the man," I gasped. A solitary cyclist was coming towards us. His head was down and his shoulders rounded as he put every ounce of energy he had possessed into the pedals. He was flying like a racer. Suddenly he raised his bearded face and saw us to close him. And pulling up, springing from his machine, the coal-black beard was a singular contrast to the pallor of his face, and his eyes were as bright as he had a fever. He stared at us at the dog-cart, then took an amazement that came over his face. "Hello, stop there!" he shouted, holding his bicycle to block our road. "Wherever did you get that dog-cart? Pull up, man!" he yelled, drawing a pistol from his side pocket. "Pull up, I say, or by George, it'll be a bullet in your horse." Holmes threw the reins into my lap and sprang down from the cart. "You're the man I want to see. Where's Miss Violet Smith?" he said, with a quick, clear way. "That's what I was asking you. You're in the dog-cart. You ought to know where she is." "We met the dog-cart on the road. There was no one in it. We drove back to help the young lady." Good Lord, what shall I do?" cried the stranger in an ecstasy of despair. "They've got her, that hellhound Woodley, and the blackguard Person. Come, man, come. If you really are her friend, stand by me and we'll save her together, if I have to leave my carcass in Charlington Wood." He ran distractedly, his pistol in his hand, towards the gap in the hedge. Holmes followed him, and I, leaving the horse grazing beside the road, followed Holmes. "This is the point they came through," said he, pointing to the marks in several feet upon the muddy path. "Hola, stop a minute. Who's this in the bush?" It was a young fellow about 17, dressed like an ostler, with leather cords and garters. He lay upon his back, his knees drawn up, a terrible cut upon his head. He was insensitive, but alive. A glance at his wound told me that he had not been penetrated to the bone. "That's Peter, the groom," cried the stranger. "He drove her. The beasts have pulled him off and clubbed him. Let him lie. We can't do him any good, but we can save her from the worst fate that can befall a woman." We ran frantically down the path, which wound among the trees. We had reached the shrubbery which surrounded the house when Holmes pulled up. "They didn't go into the house. Here are their marks on the left here, beside the laurel bushes. Ah, I said so." As he spoke, a woman's shrill scream, and a scream which reverberated from the frenzy of horror, burst from the thick green clump of bushes in front of us. It ended suddenly in the high tone of a note, choke, and a gurgle. "This way, this way! They're in the bowling alley!" cried the stranger, darting through the bushes. "Ah, the cowardly dogs! Follow me, gentlemen! Too late, too late! By the living jingo!" We had broken suddenly into a lovely glade and greensward surrounded by ancient trees. On the farther side of it, under the shadow of a mighty oak, there stood a singular group of 3 people. One was a woman, reclined drooping and faint, a handkerchief around her mouth. Opposite her stood the brutal, heavy-faced, red-moustached young man, his gaitering legs parted wide, his arms akimbo, the other waving a riding crop, his whole attitude suggestive of triumphant bravado. Between them, an elderly, grey-bearded man, wearing a short surplice over a light tweed suit, had evidently just completed the wedding service, for he pocketed a prayer book and appeared and slapped the sinister bridegroom upon the back in a jovial congratulation. "They're married," I gasped. "Come on," cried our guide. "Come on." He rushed across the glade, Holmes and I at his heels. As we approached, the lady staggered back against the trunk of a tree for support. Williamson, the ex-clergyman, bowed us with mock politeness, and the bully Woodley advanced with a shout and brutal, excellent laughter. "You can take your beard off, Bob," he said. I know you right enough. Well, you and your pals have just come in time to be able to introduce you to Mrs. Woodley." Our guide's answer was a singular one. He snatched off the dark beard which had disguised him and threw it on the ground, and disclosed the long, sallow, clean-shaven face below it. Then he raised his revolver and covered the young ruffian who was advancing upon him with his dangerous riding crop swinging in his hand. "Yes," said our ally, "I am Bob Carruthers, and I'll see the woman righted if I have to swing it for. I told you what I'd do if you molested her, and by the Lord I'll be as good as my word." "You're too late. She's my wife." "No, she's your widow." The revolver cracked, and I saw the blood spurt from the front of Woodley's waistcoat. He spun around with a scream and fell upon his back, his hideous red face turning suddenly to a dreadful mottled pallor. The old man, still clad in his surplice, burst into such a string of foul oaths I have never heard, and pulled out a revolver of his own. But before he could raise it, he was looking down the barrel of Holmes's weapon. "Enough of this," said my friend coldly. "Drop that pistol. Watson, pick it up. Hold it to his head. Thank you. You, Carruthers, give me that revolver. We'll have no more violence. Come, hand it over." "Who are you, then?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes." "Good Lord!" "You have heard of me, I see. I will represent the official police until their arrival. Here, you." He shouted to a frightened groom who had appeared at the edge of the glade. "Come here. Take this note as hard as you can ride to Farning." He scribbled a few notes upon a leaf from his notebook. "Give it to the superintendent at the police station. Until he comes, I must detain you all under my personal custody." The strong, masterful personality of Holmes dominated the tragic scene. and all were equally puppets in his hands. Williamson and Carruthers found themselves carrying the wounded Woodley into the house, and I gave my arm to the frightened girl. The injured man was laid on his bed, and Holmes requested I examine him. I carried my report to where he sat in the old tapestry-hung dining room with his 2 prisoners before him. "He will live," I said. "What?" cried Carruthers, springing out of his chair. "I'll go upstairs and finish him first." "Do you tell that to the girl? The angel is to be tied to the roadly Jack Woodley for life?" "You need not concern yourself about that," said Holmes. "There are 2 very good reasons why she should under no circumstance be his wife. In the first place, we are very safe in questioning Mr. Williamson's right to solemnise a marriage." "I've been ordained," said the old rascal, "and also unfrocked." "Once a clergyman, always a clergyman." "I think not. How about the license?" "We had a license for the marriage. I have it here in my pocket." "Then you got it by a trick. But in any case, a forged marriage is no marriage. But it is a very serious felony, and you will discover before you have finished. You'll have time to think that point out during the next 10 years or so, unless I'm mistaken. As to you, Carruthers, you would have done better to keep your pistol in your pocket." "I begin to think so, Mr. Holmes, but when I thought of all the precaution I had taken to shield this girl, for I loved her, Mr. Holmes, and it is the only time that I ever knew what love was, it fairly drove me mad to think that she was in the power of the greatest brute and bully in South Africa, a man whose name is a holy terror from Kimberley to Johannesburg. Why, Mr. Holmes, you'll hardly believe it, but ever since that girl has been in my employment, I never once let her go past this house where I knew the rascals were lurking without following her on my bicycle, just to see that she came to no harm. I kept my distance from her, and I wore a beard so that she would not recognize me, for she is a good and high-spirited girl, and she wouldn't have stayed in my employment long if she had thought that I was following her about on country roads." "Why didn't you tell her of her danger?" "Because then, again, she would have left me, and I couldn't bear that fact. Even if she couldn't love me, it was no great deal to me just to have her dainty form about the house and to hear the sound of her voice." "Well," said I, "you call that love, Mr. Carruthers. I should call it selfishness." "Maybe the 2 things go together. Anyhow, I couldn't let her go. Besides, with this crowd about, it was well that she should have someone near to look after her. And then when the cable came, and I knew that they were bound to make a move." "What cable?" Carruthers took a telegram from his pocket. "That's it," said he. "It was short and concise. The old man is dead." Said Holmes. "I think I see how things worked, and I can understand how this message would, as you say, bring them to a head. But while we can wait, you might tell me what you can." The old reprobate was in surprise, burst into a volley of bad language. "By heavens," he said, "if you squeal on me as Bob Carruthers, I'll serve you as you served Jack Woodley. You can bleat about the girl with your heart's content. That's your own affair. But if you round on your pals and this plainclothes copper, it will be the worst day that you ever did." "Your reverence need not be excited," said Holmes, lighting a cigarette. "The case is clear enough against you, and all I ask is a few details for my private curiosity. However, if there's any difficulty in your telling me, I'll do the talking, and then you will see how far you have the chance of holding back your secrets. In the first place, 3 of you came from South Africa on this game. You, Williamson, and you, Carruthers, and Woodley." "Lie number 1, said the old man. "I neither saw either of them until 2 months ago, and I've never been to Africa in my life, so you can put that in your pipe and smoke it, Mr. Busybody Holmes." "What he says is true," said Carruthers. Well. 2 of you came over. His reverence is his own made article.
You had known Ralph Smith in South Africa. You had reason to believe he would not live long. You found out that his niece would inherit his fortune. That's so, eh?
Crothers nodded, and Williamson swore.
She was next of kin, no doubt, and you were aware that the old fellow would make no will.
Couldn't read nor write, said Crothers. So you came over, the two of you, and hunted up the girl. The idea was that one of you was to marry her and the other have a share of the plunder. For some reason, Woodley was chosen as the husband. Why was that? We played cards for her on the voyage. He won.
I see. You got the young lady into your service, and then Woodley was to do the courting. She recognized the drunken brute that he was, and would have nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, your arrangement was rather upset by the fact that you had yourself fallen in love with the lady. You could no longer bear the idea of this ruffian owning her.
No, by George, I couldn't.
There was a quarrel between you. He left you in a rage and began to make his own plans independently of you.
Strikes me, Williamson, there isn't very much that we can tell this gentleman, cried Crothers, with a rather bitter laugh. Yes, we quarreled, and he knocked me down, and I'm level with him on that. Then I lost sight of him. That was when I picked up the Cas Padre here. I found that he had set up housekeeping together in this place and on the line that she was to pass the station. I kept my eye on her after that, for I knew there was some devilry in the wind. I saw them from time to time, for I was anxious to know what they were after. 2 days ago, Woodley came up to my house with his cable, which showed me that Ralph was dead. He asked me if I would stand by the bargain. I said I would not. He asked me if I would marry the girl myself and give him a share. I said I would willingly do so, but that she would not have me. He said, let us get her married first, and after a week or two she may see things a bit differently. I said I would have nothing to do with violence, so he went off cursing, like the foul-mouthed blackguard that he was, and swearing that he would have her yet. She was leaving me this weekend, and I had got a trap to take her to the station, but I was so uneasy in my mind that I followed her on my bicycle. She had got a start, however, and before I could catch her, the mischief was done. First thing I knew, it was about when I saw you two gentlemen driving back in her dog cart. Holmes rose and tossed the end of his cigarette into the grate. I've been very obtuse, Watson, he said. One in your report you said that you had seen the cyclist, as you thought, arrange the necktie for his shrubbery. That alone would have told me all. However, we may congratulate ourselves upon a curious, unique case. I perceive there are 3 of the county constabulary in the drive, and I'm glad to see that the little ostler is able to keep pace with him. So it is likely that neither he nor the interesting bridegroom will be permanently damaged by this morning's adventures. I think, Watson, that in your medical capacity you might wait upon Miss Smith and tell her that she is sufficiently recovered. We shall be happy to escort her to her mother's home. If she is not quite convalescent, you will find that the hints that we were about to telegraph to a young electrician in the Midlands would probably complete the cure. As to you, Mr. Crothers, I think that you have done what you could to make amends for your share in this evil plot. There is my card, sir, and if you have any evidence to help you with your trial, it shall be at your disposal. In the whirl of our incessant activity, it was often been difficult for me, as the reader has probably observed, to round off my narratives and give those final details which the curious might expect. Each case has been a prelude to another, and the crisis over one of the actors has passed forever out of the busy lives. I find, however, a short note at the end of my manuscripts dealing with this case, in which I have put upon record that Miss Violet Smith did indeed inherit a large fortune, and that she is now the wife of Cyril Morton, the senior partner of Morton and Kennedy, the famous Westminster electricians. Williamson and Woodley were both tried for abduction and assault, after getting 7 years and later 10. Of the fate of Crothers I have no record, but I'm sure that his assault was not viewed very gravely by the court, since Woodley had the reputation of being a most dangerous ruffian, and I think that a few months were sufficient to satisfy the demands of justice.